I don't know if you've seen this or not, but the Gators have. Well, I don't think it's the Gators doing it, but Netflix has got a documentary coming out about the 2006 to 2009 Florida Gators. So the time that Urban Meyer was there with Tim Tebow and company, and it got me thinking about what season would be the best one to do a documentary on of the Georgia Bulldogs in recent memory. I think there's a lot of seasons. I mean, when I say recent memory, my specialty in terms of what I really know the best about Georgia starts really in about 94, but specifically 95 to now. So I would say that the most compelling season was probably the worst season lately, which was 2015. It was a bizarre year that I've written about it extensively over on the site, over on dawgpost.com. If you're not a member there, you're missing out on stories like this. And that season set into motion really everything we've seen since, including stuff for other schools. Don't forget that in 2015, Georgia was coming off a season in 2014 where Todd Gurley missed half the season, part of it because of NCAA sanctions, the other part because of an ACL injury at the end of the season. There was dispute about what would happen at quarterback, but long-term offensive coordinator Mike Bobo was gone. He'd gone to Colorado State. So what was likely going to happen, which was Bryce Ramsey starting, went out the window as soon as Mike Bobo left. Enter in a power shift from the head coach, Mark Richt, who could trust Mike Bobo. And Mike was a balance for Jeremy Pruitt, who was a bad hire by Mark. And all hell broke loose. All hell broke loose. Speaking of which, Them Dogs Is Hell, that's the title of our 2023 preview edition for the season. I ran out of these last year, so when you pick up Double Dogs today, you'll get both. You get both. So that's the link that's down below. You can pick up just the 23 preview. But if you buy the book right now, you're getting it. You're getting the preview included for free. That's what's down below. But when Brian Schottenheimer arrived at Georgia, it was pretty clear something was wrong. Something had happened, and obviously the offense went backwards in a big way. It did not help that Nick Chubb was hurt and basically knocked out the rest of the season at Tennessee. But the game before that is really the game to focus on. First of all, it was evident that Bryce Ramsey was, may have been the most gifted quarterback, but he wasn't doing what he needed to do to win the job, A. B, Brian Schottenheimer is an idiot. We got that too. So it fell to Grayson Lambert, who was the most consistent and had started before at Virginia, but he couldn't do it. And I mean, it's nothing against him, but that was obvious in game one against Vanderbilt when the offense just looked putrid. Grayson has an unbelievable game against South Carolina. I still can't believe South Carolina let him do all they did. And, that was the last game Steve Spurrier ever coached against Georgia, a blowout loss to the Dogs. Steve looked scared coming off the field. I was there. I walked with him off the field, and he legitimately looked scared. He held his hands over his ears. I was concerned for him. I asked him post-game if he was scared, and he said no, but it looked like it to me. And then, you fast forward to the Alabama game, and I'll never forget the beginning of the Alabama game because the rest of it was a total mess, including getting rained on the entire game. In that game, Alabama comes out for warm-ups, and the stadium is what back then in 15 was not structured the way it is now. Now Georgia has its own entrance from the opposite side of the field, a non-traditional entrance, which is becoming traditional, I guess. But they came at that time from the closed end zone. So did the other team. So when both teams came out to warm up, Alabama's team jogged onto the field, and when they jogged through Georgia's warm-ups. Now, I don't think necessarily that Alabama was necessarily doing anything bad, but some of the Georgia players got fired up about the way that Alabama was running through. But I have to say, logistically, it was kind of hard to get to your side of the field if you're Alabama without going through the Georgia area. They would all have to be in a, and this is players. I mean, they're going to have something to say. So there was a near fight before that game, and it wasn't the Alabama kids. It was the Georgia kids. And I was very near that when that happened. I was at midfield, actually. When Kirby and his defense ran onto the field, that was really when it started. And, Kirby just kept running. He didn't, and I remember Keelan Johnson saying something to Kirby like, what was that about? And Kirby was just like, we don't care. We're not here to fight. And they weren't. They were there to win. And they did. And let me tell you. The game later, Georgia's offense is a disaster again against Tennessee, just like they were a disaster every single game. And, that season, they won 10 games, Georgia, somehow. But they nearly lost to Georgia Southern. They nearly lost to a bad Auburn team. They played around with Georgia Tech. But it was in Jacksonville, really, where that year fell apart completely. If it hadn't already fallen apart, it was about to fall apart. And in that game, Georgia could have beaten Florida and won the SEC East, even with all this dysfunction, okay? The week before against Missouri, again, the offense doesn't score a touchdown. And it's obvious they got to make a change. And they made a change at quarterback, which is about all you can do. But they go to Fatone Bauta. I mean, just a bizarre decision that made no sense in any way. Frankly, at that point, you should stick with Grayson Lambert. But Grayson couldn't do it. Like I said, some of us knew that at the beginning of the season. Maybe none of them could do it. But it was clear Grayson could not. They go to Florida, and Fatone has 4 turnovers. It was a disaster. This was not a great Florida team. This was an adequate Florida team that was getting their ass beat in by every team that was ranked that they played, okay? They lose that game, and if it wasn't evident that Mark had been fired at that point or was going to be fired, it was evident that night. They were just, it was disaster. So I think if you talk about a season where a documentary would be curious, I've done a lot of this reporting, that would be the season. Because, when we left the field at Bobby Dodd, Mark Richt Field at Bobby Dodd Stadium, it was not obvious that Mark Richt was going to get fired. Looking back, it was. Looking back, it was obvious he was probably going to get fired after the Tennessee game, but it was cemented after Florida. And, they just were not doing what they needed to do on the recruiting trail, number one, and on the field, number 2. And it was time for a change. The biggest mistake that Mark made was hiring Jeremy Pruitt. He was a real problem. And I think that's gone to that we've seen how that's played out for Tennessee. But that wasn't the only mistake. And Mark Richt is a great coach. He's not sort of a good coach. He's probably, you can make the argument he's the second best coach in Georgia history. You'd have to compare him to Vince Dooley. And Vince has won national championship. That's another discussion for another time. But Mark let it go too far in 2015, and that he deserved the fate that he got. But if there's a time that I would like to see even more behind the scenes that I already know about, it would be then. Because Jeremy Pruitt wasn't all evil. They worked. Brian Schottenheimer didn't. It wasn't. Nothing was working And there was plenty of discussion about Brian Schottenheimer not working at a pace at which he needed to. If you've never read the story about what happened at Georgia in 2015, you need to go read it over on Dawg Post, because there's a lot of discussion there about how everything was mishandled.